Parisian pharmacies sold heroin over the counter as cough medicine, not in back alleys, not from criminal dealers, from respectable pharmacies on the Champs-Élysées, where well-dressed women purchased it alongside aspirin and tooth powder. Between 1920 and 1925, Bayer Pharmaceutical supplied French pharmacies with over 400 kilograms of pharmaceutical-grade heroin annually. The French medical establishment endorsed it as safer than morphine. Ministry of Health documents archived at the Bibliothèque nationale show government officials actively promoted heroin's availability as a sign of medical progress. This isn't fiction. This is the story of how an entire generation of artists, writers, and intellectuals built their identities around a drug that pharmacists handed them in paper packets. Here's what makes this impossible to understand from our distance. They weren't rebelling. They were following medical advice. The same doctors who treated their tuberculosis prescribed heroin for melancholy, for artistic blocks, for the exhaustion of modern life. According to research by historian Emmanuel Retello-Bahac, preserved at the Institut d'Histoire de Paris, over 60% of heroin users in 1920s Paris initially obtained the drug through legitimate medical prescriptions. These weren't outlaws, they were patients. But here's the question that haunts this story. When does medicine become addiction? When does treatment become dependence? And what happens to love when two people share the same needle? So it's late. Maybe you can't sleep, or maybe you just don't want to. Either way, I appreciate you being here. Drop a comment telling me what keeps you up at night. The honest answer, not the polite one. And if you want more stories about the moments when society's rules collided with human desire, hit subscribe. These stories take weeks to research, and knowing you're out there makes the work worthwhile. Now, let me take you somewhere specific. It's March 17th, 1922. You're walking down Boulevard du Montparnasse at 3 in the morning. The air tastes like tobacco and burnt sugar from the cafes that never close. Your shoes click against wet cobblestones. You can hear jazz, actual American jazz, spilling from a basement club called Le Boeuf sur le Toit. The war ended 3 years ago, but Paris still feels like it's celebrating survival. You push through a heavy door into warmth and cigarette smoke. The room smells like perfume and sweat and something medicinal you can't quite place. A woman in a green dress laughs too loudly at something that isn't funny. A man with paint under his fingernails sketches on a napkin with intense concentration. The pianist doesn't look at his hands. You're here because everyone is here. Hemingway might be at that corner table. Cocteau definitely is. You recognise his profile, that sharp nose silhouetted against the bar lights. Someone touches your arm and offers you a cigarette case, but when you open it, you see small paper packets folded into precise squares. Buyer's finest, they say, smiling, fresh from the pharmacy this afternoon. This is the moment you need to understand. What they're offering you isn't scandalous, it's fashionable. According to medical records analysed by Dr. Jean-Jacques Ivorel at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, Parisian physicians wrote over 40,000 heroin prescriptions in 1922 alone. The drug was legal, medically sanctioned, and considered an improvement over the morphine that had enslaved so many wounded soldiers during the Great War. What happened next would transform not just individual lives, but the entire culture of artistic Paris. And it started with the simple belief that chemistry could solve the problem of being human. Paris in 1922 existed in a strange temporal space, suspended between the trauma of yesterday and the uncertainty of tomorrow. The Great War had killed 1.4 million French soldiers and wounded millions more. According to archives at the Musée de la Grande Guerre, over 800,000 French veterans returned home, addicted to morphine, administered liberally in field hospitals where screaming men far outnumbered available doctors. The pharmaceutical industry presented heroin as the solution to this crisis. Developed by Bayer in 1898, diacetyl morphine, marketed under the brand name Heroin, was initially synthesized to treat morphine addiction. The bitter irony wouldn't become clear for decades. In 1920, French medical journals published articles with titles like The Promise of Heroin in Modern Therapeutics and Liberation from Morphine Through Scientific Progress. These weren't fringe publications. They were mainstream medical literature, preserved at the Académie nationale de médecine. Dr. Henri Claudel, a prominent Parisian psychiatrist, wrote in a 1921 essay, "Heroin represents our capacity to improve upon nature's remedies. Where morphine enslaves, heroin liberates." His words were quoted in Le Figaro and Le Temps, the newspapers that shaped French public opinion. But Paris wasn't just recovering from war, it was becoming the global capital of modernism. Artists flooded into the city from America, Britain, Russia, and Germany. The exchange rate made Paris affordable for foreigners with even modest incomes. Gertrude Stein's salon on the Rue de Fleurus hosted weekly gatherings. Sylvia Beach opened Shakespeare and Company in 1919. The Dada movement was exploding into surrealism. According to historian Tyler Stovall's research published in Paris Noir, over 50,000 American expatriates lived in Paris by 1923, alongside Russian émigrés fleeing revolution and German artists escaping inflation. These weren't tourists. They were refugees from conventional life, seeking a space where art mattered more than propriety, where you could be gay without prosecution, where a woman could drink alone at a cafe without scandal. Paris promised liberation, and that liberation for many was chemically enhanced. The city's cafe culture created a specific economy of substances. Absinthe had been banned in 1915, leaving a void that wine, cognac and cocaine initially filled. But heroin offered something different, not the chaos of cocaine or the stupor of alcohol, but a warm numbness that made loneliness feel like chosen solitude. Jean Cocteau, in his memoir Opium, preserved at the Bibliothèque littéraire Jacques Doucet, described heroin as a room made of silk where everything difficult became distant. The demographics were specific. According to police records analysed by historian Bertrand Tillier, the typical Parisian heroin user in the early 1920s was male, between 25 and 35, employed in creative fields and living in the 5th, 6th or 14th arrondissement, the Latin Quarter, Saint-Germain-des-Prés and Montparnasse. These were the neighbourhoods where rents were cheap enough for artists, where cafes stayed open late, where your neighbours were writers and painters who kept similar hours. Women used heroin too, though their consumption was documented differently. Medical case files from the Hôpital Saint-Louis, studied by historian Anne-Claude Ambroise Rondeau, reveal that female heroin users were more likely to be classified as suffering from hysteria or neurasthenia, their addiction medicalised in ways that male users was not. Society could accept a male artist's chemical experimentation as part of creative genius. A woman's drug use was pathology requiring institutional intervention. But in the cafes of Montparnasse, gender mattered less than vocabulary. You needed to know the language. Blanche for heroin, la pharmacie for your dealer's apartment. Going to see the doctor meant scoring. According to interviews conducted in the 1960s by sociologist Jean-Paul Sarrazin with elderly Parisians who remembered the era, this linguistic camouflage allowed people to discuss their drug use openly while maintaining plausible deniability. The physical infrastructure supported this culture. Pharmacies clustered near artist neighbourhoods. The Pharmacie Centrale on Boulevard Saint-Michel, for example, filled an average of 60 heroin prescriptions daily in 1922, according to business records preserved at the Archives de Paris. Doctors sympathetic to artistic clientele established practices near Montparnasse Café. Dr. Maurice Fleury-Lévy, whose case files were studied by medical historian Bertrand Weil, prescribed heroin to dozens of writers and artists, often noting in his records that the medication was for creative exhaustion or artistic melancholy. The social rituals had already formed. Small groups would gather in apartments after the cafes closed. Someone would have purchased a few grams earlier that day. They'd divide it carefully, mixing it with a bit of lemon juice or wine, sometimes injecting, sometimes inhaling the powder. According to descriptions in unpublished memoirs at the Bibliothèque littéraire Jacques Doucet, these gatherings were intimate, almost ceremonial. People would read poetry aloud, discuss philosophy, sketch each other's portraits while the drug worked its way through their systems. What made this moment dangerous wasn't the drug alone. It was the convergence of supply, ideology, and circumstance. A generation traumatized by industrial warfare, seeking meaning in art and connection. A medical establishment that believed chemistry could solve psychological suffering. A pharmaceutical industry aggressively marketing a drug it didn't fully understand. And a city that had always tolerated behaviour other places condemned. By late 1922, patterns were emerging that careful observers might have found concerning. The same people appeared at the cafes every night, at the same times, with the same urgent energy. Certain artists became noticeably thinner, their skin taking on a greyish cast. Pharmacies near Montparnasse reported suspicious patterns, the same customers returning every few days, always needing refills. But nobody was worried yet. How could they be? The packages came from legitimate pharmacies, prescribed by licensed physicians, manufactured by one of Germany's most respected pharmaceutical companies. If this was addiction, it wore a white coat and carried impeccable credentials. The catalyst wasn't a single moment. It was a confluence that happened gradually, then suddenly. In January 1923, Raymond Radiguet collapsed at Le Boeuf-sur-le-Toit. 20 years old, already famous for his novel Le Diable au corps, he'd been using heroin for 8 months. According to Jean Cocteau's account in Portrait Souvenir, preserved at the Centre Pompidou archives, Radiguet had been taking increasingly large doses to manage what he called the terror of the blank page. That night, witnesses reported, he simply fell forward, his face hitting the table before anyone could react. He didn't die that night. He'd die 11 months later from typhoid fever, but everyone who'd been there remembered the collapse as a threshold, the first public rupture in the illusion that you could use heroin recreationally without consequence. But Radiguet's collapse might have remained an isolated incident, if not for what happened 3 weeks later. On January 28, 1923, the French government received a report from Dr. Paul Girard, head of toxicology at the Paris Prefecture of Police. According to documents archived at the Centre d'Archives Contemporaines, Girard had been quietly tracking hospital admissions related to heroin since 1921. His findings were stark. Admissions for morphinism and heroinism had increased 340% between 1920 and 1922. The number of documented overdoses had risen from 12 to 89. And for the first time, he was seeing a new phenomenon. People who had never used morphine, who had started directly with heroin, who showed dependence patterns within weeks of first use. The report should have triggered immediate action. Instead, it sparked a debate that would take 2 years to resolve. The French medical establishment split into camps. One group, led by Dr. Maurice Reynaud, argued that the increase in addiction represented medical mismanagement. Doctors were prescribing too liberally to the wrong patients without proper supervision. Better regulation of prescriptions would solve the problem while preserving heroin's legitimate medical uses. The opposing faction, championed by Dr. Henri Claudel, the same physician who praised heroin 2 years earlier, took a more defensive position. In a February 1923 article in the Bulletin de l'Académie de Médecine, Claudel argued that reports of heroin addiction were exaggerated, that most cases involved morphine addicts who transferred their dependence, and that restricting access would punish legitimate patients suffering from chronic pain. While doctors debated, users noticed something else. The drug was changing. By mid-1923, multiple sources document the same phenomenon. People who'd used heroin reliably for months found their usual doses no longer worked. They needed more to achieve the same effect. According to medical case studies published by Dr. Paul Voivenel, preserved at the Bibliothèque interuniversitaire de santé, this tolerance developed with remarkable speed, much faster than with morphine or opium. Some patients reported needing to double their dose within 3 months. And something else was happening, something harder to document but present in every personal account: withdrawal. When supplies ran short, when prescriptions couldn't be filled, when people tried to stop using, their bodies rebelled. The symptoms appeared in medical literature with clinical precision: profound anxiety, muscle pain, insomnia, nausea, and what one doctor described as a psychological distress of exceptional intensity. Kiki de Montparnasse, the model and actress whose memoirs were published posthumously, described withdrawal in her diary. "It feels like your skin is trying to crawl off your bones, like every nerve is screaming. You'd do anything to make it stop, absolutely anything." Her papers, housed at the Musée du Montparnasse, reveal that she underwent 3 attempts to quit heroin between 1923 and 1924, each ending when the withdrawal became unbearable. The response in artist circles was predictable. They used more. According to police surveillance reports studied by historian Emmanuel Retailleau-Bajac, heroin consumption in Montparnasse cafés increased even as evidence of its dangers mounted. This wasn't denial, it was logic. If the problem was tolerance, the solution was a larger dose. If the problem was withdrawal, the solution was never running out. This created the first wave of what we'd now call drug-seeking behaviour. Artists who'd previously been casual users found themselves planning their days around pharmaceutical operating hours. Prescription fraud began appearing, people stealing prescription pads from doctors, offices forging signatures, visiting multiple pharmacies to avoid raising suspicion. According to court records from the Tribunal Correctionnel de la Seine, prosecutions for prescription fraud increased from 3 in 1922 to 47 in 1923. But the most significant change was social. Heroin was beginning to sort people into new categories: those who could control their use and those who couldn't, those who had reliable access and those who were desperate, those whose lives still functioned and those who were beginning to unravel. Simone Thérèse Fernande, a model known professionally as Thérèse Treys, represents this transition. According to police records and hospital admissions documented by historian Anne-Claude Ambroise Rondeau, Thérèse began using heroin in 1921 when her doctor prescribed it for chronic back pain from a modelling accident. By 1923, she was visiting 4 different doctors to maintain her supply. By 1924, she'd lost her modelling contracts, been evicted from 2 apartments, and was supporting her habit through sex work. Her case file, preserved at the Archives de l'Assistance Publique, charts a descent that took less than 3 years. The expansion phase had begun. What started as medicine had become recreation. What started as recreation was becoming necessity. And the city that had embraced heroin as liberation was beginning to realise it had welcomed something else entirely. What nobody understood yet, what wouldn't become clear for another year, was that tolerance and withdrawal were only the beginning. Heroin was rewiring the basic machinery of human attachment, and the consequences would be most visible in the place humans are most vulnerable: love. Here's what makes the story of heroin and romance in 1920s Paris so complex. The drug didn't destroy relationships. Not at first. Initially, it seemed to intensify them. According to unpublished letters between Jean Cocteau and Raymond Radiguet, preserved at the Bibliothèque littéraire Jacques Doucet, Cocteau described their shared heroin use as creating a private language, a shared country that others cannot enter. This wasn't unique. Multiple sources from the period describe couples who used together as experiencing a particular kind of intimacy, a mutual vulnerability, a shared secret, a bond strengthened by the ritual of use and the privacy it required. The chemical mechanism was real. Heroin floods the brain's opioid receptors, triggering massive dopamine release, the same neurological system involved in romantic attachment. According to contemporary neuroscience research by Dr. Rita Goldstein at the Brookhaven National Laboratory, chronic heroin use literally hijacks the brain's bonding circuitry. When two people use together, their brains begin associating each other with the reward state produced by the drug. They become chemically entangled. But in 1923, nobody knew this. What they experienced was simpler. Using heroin with someone you loved felt profound, felt like the drug revealed some deeper truth about your connection. Multiple memoirs from the period describe the same sensation, that heroin showed you who people really were, stripped away social performance, revealed authentic selves. Take the relationship between Maurice Sacks and Jacques Guérin, documented in Sacks's memoir Le Sabbat and in Guérin's papers at the Bibliothèque nationale. They met in 1923, both already occasional heroin users. Within weeks they were using together daily. Sacks wrote, "The drug made everything else disappear except what was essential between us. It was like seeing someone through perfect clarity, without the distortion of ordinary consciousness." This illusion of enhanced intimacy had a mechanism. Heroin reduces anxiety, eliminates self-consciousness, creates a state of chemical contentment that feels like perfect acceptance. When two anxious, self-conscious artists used together, they experienced each other without their usual defences. They mistook the drug's effects for emotional revelation. But here's what was actually happening, preserved in medical case studies from the Hôpital Saint-Louis. Heroin was becoming the third party in every relationship. Dr. Maurice Ducret, in a 1924 report on heroinism among artistic populations, described what he called triangular dependence, couples whose primary relationship was no longer with each other, but with the drug, mediated through each other. The pattern appeared with remarkable consistency. Couples who used together stopped having sex. Heroin suppresses libido and makes orgasm difficult or impossible. According to confidential medical records studied by historian Bertrand Weil, over 70% of heroin-using couples reported complete cessation of sexual activity within 6 months of beginning regular use. But they stayed together, often sleeping in the same bed, maintaining physical intimacy without sexuality. The relationship became something else, not quite romantic, not quite fraternal, but bound by shared need. This transformation is documented most painfully in the diary of Thérèse Franck, a Belgian painter who came to Paris in 1922. Her journal, preserved at the Musée Royal des Beaux-Arts in Brussels, tracks her relationship with French poet Robert Gilbert. They met in January 1923, began a romance, started using heroin together that spring. By October, she was writing, "We don't make love anymore, we barely talk, but we can't be apart. When he's late, I feel like I might die, not because I miss him, because I need what he's bringing." That last distinction is crucial. The relationship hadn't ended. It had been repurposed. Robert wasn't primarily her lover anymore. He was her connection to heroin, and she was his. They needed each other because they needed the drug, and the drug was easier to obtain, to use, to justify when you had a partner to share it with. This pattern intensified when supply became uncertain. By late 1923, as prescription, regulations began tightening, couples found themselves planning elaborate strategies to maintain their supply. According to police reports from the Archives de la Préfecture de Police, a common technique involved couples visiting different doctors, each claiming the other was too ill to come in person, each obtaining prescriptions they'd combine. Some couples developed elaborate schedules, alternating which pharmacies they'd visit, which doctors they'd see, spacing appointments to avoid suspicion. The drugs became more important than the relationship, but the relationship became necessary for the drugs. It was a closed loop, and once you were inside it, escape became geometrically harder. The most documented case is probably Jean Cocteau and Jean Desbordes, whose relationship began in 1924. According to Cocteau's biographer Claude Arnault, drawing on letters and medical records, they were both heavily addicted to heroin within months of meeting. Their correspondence, preserved at the Centre Pompidou, reveals a relationship structured entirely around maintaining supply. Whole letters are devoted to discussing which doctor might write a prescription, which pharmacy still had stock, whether they had enough to last through the weekend. In one letter from 1925, Cocteau wrote, "I love you more than my life, but I need the Blanche more than I need you. This is not a confession. It is simply the truth we both live with." That brutal honesty appears again and again in documents from this period. The drug didn't create lies about love. It created a clarity that might have been more merciful if accompanied by dishonesty. Couples knew they were more attached to heroin than to each other. They stayed together anyway. But relationships structured around heroin faced a specific vulnerability. What happened when only one person wanted to quit? Medical records from the Hôpital Saint-Louis document 89 cases between 1923 and 1925, where one partner attempted withdrawal while the other continued using. According to Dr. Paul Voivenel's analysis, these attempts succeeded only 11 times. In every other case, either the abstinent partner relapsed or the relationship ended. The mechanism was simple and terrible. Withdrawal is excruciating. Watching someone you love go through withdrawal while you still use is unbearable. The immediate relief is right there. Just share your dose. Except doing that means pulling them back into addiction, and refusing feels like cruelty, like withholding medicine from someone in pain. Suzanne Valadon's letters to her son Maurice Utrillo, who struggled with both alcoholism and heroin addiction, capture this impossible position. She wanted him to get clean. She couldn't stand watching him suffer through withdrawal. She gave him money that she knew he'd use to get high. She hated herself for it. She did it anyway. Her letters, studied by art historian June Rose, reveal the specific torture of loving someone whose illness you simultaneously want to cure and cannot bear to watch them endure. And then there was violence. Police records from the Commissariat du 6e arrondissement, analysed by historian Emmanuel Retailleau-Bachac, show a sharp increase in domestic violence reports from heroin-using couples between 1923 and 1925. Withdrawal made people irritable, paranoid, aggressive. The desperate need for heroin made people accuse their partners of hiding doses, of using more than their share, of lying about money. But the violence was also about power. In relationships where both partners were addicted, whoever controlled access to the drug controlled the relationship. According to case files from the Tribunal Correctionnel, men use this power predictably. Multiple cases document men withholding heroin from female partners to enforce compliance, to punish, to coerce. The case of Lucienne Boyer and her partner André Larocque, documented in court records from 1925, represents the darkest version of this pattern. Larocque controlled their heroin supply. When Boyer threatened to leave, he'd withhold her dose until she behaved properly. When she tried to get her own prescription, he convinced her doctor that she was mentally unstable, that he needed to supervise her medication. She stayed in that relationship for 3 years, not because she loved him. Her own testimony states she despised him, but because leaving meant enduring withdrawal alone, with no guaranteed access to the drug that had become necessary for functioning. This wasn't every relationship. Some couples protected each other, tried to quit together, supported each other's recovery. But heroin made all relationships more fragile, more desperate, more vulnerable to the basic cruelty that humans are capable of when they're suffering. By 1924, a new term was appearing in medical literature: folie à deux, shared madness. Doctors used it to describe couples so entangled in addiction that they seemed to have merged into a single organism, each unable to function without the other's presence and the drug that bound them. According to psychiatric case studies preserved at the Bibliothèque interuniversitaire de santé, these couples often appeared in hospitals together, both in withdrawal, both insisting they couldn't be treated separately. The love stories that began in Montparnasse cafes in 1922, fueled by the belief that heroin enhanced consciousness and deepened connection, had transformed into something else entirely by 1924. Not exactly love, not exactly addiction, but a hybrid state where the difference no longer mattered. People stayed together because leaving meant facing withdrawal alone. They stayed because their partner was their most reliable source. They stayed because the drug had rewired their attachment systems until they literally could not tell the difference between loving someone and needing what they provided. And underlying everything was the terrible knowledge that the relationship would end in one of three ways: both would quit, one would quit alone, or neither would survive. There was no fourth option. Everyone knew this. Nobody knew how to escape it. This was the hidden dimension that doctors and pharmacists and even users themselves hadn't anticipated. Heroin didn't just addict individuals. It created systems of mutual dependence that mimicked love while destroying the possibility of actual intimacy. It built relationships that looked like partnerships but functioned like shared suicide pacts. And it was about to get worse because the supply was about to change. By early 1924, the French government could no longer ignore what was happening. According to ministerial documents preserved at the Archives nationale, the Ministry of Health received reports from hospitals, police, and social workers describing what they called an epidemic of morphinism and heroinism unprecedented in modern France. On March 12, 1924, the French government issued new regulations. Heroin could still be prescribed, but doctors now needed to register each prescription with the local prefecture. Pharmacies had to maintain detailed logs of all heroin sales. Patients could no longer receive prescriptions from multiple doctors. A national registry would track who was receiving heroin and in what quantities. The intentions were reasonable. The execution was disastrous. The new regulations didn't reduce heroin use. They created a black market. According to economic historian Marion Fontaine's research, published in French Historical Studies, an underground heroin economy appeared within weeks of the new regulations. Prices immediately tripled. Quality became inconsistent. And most importantly, users who had been obtaining pharmaceutical-grade heroin from regulated sources now had to navigate a criminal economy they didn't understand. The transition was documented by Dr. Maurice Ducret at the Hôpital Saint-Louis. In a 1924 report, he noted, "We are seeing patients who have used heroin safely for years suddenly presenting with infections, overdoses, and poisoning from adulterated supplies. The regulation has not stopped the behaviour. It has made the behaviour deadly." The arithmetic was simple. A gram of pharmaceutical heroin cost about 15 francs in 1923. By July 1924, according to police reports, the same gram cost 50 francs on the black market. Users who had been spending modest amounts suddenly needed significantly more money. And unlike marijuana or cocaine, heroin withdrawal was too severe to just quit when the price increased. People did desperate things. Theft increased in Montparnasse and Saint-Germain-des-Prés. According to commissariat records studied by historian Emmanuel Retello-Bajac, reported thefts in the 6th arrondissement increased 180% between March and December 1924. Police specifically noted an increase in the theft of small valuable items, jewellery, silverware, artwork, things that could be pawned quickly. Sex work increased. Hospital records from the Hôpital Saint-Lazare, which treated women arrested for prostitution, show a sharp rise in patients testing positive for heroin. Dr. Jan Levy-Valency, in a 1925 report on heroinism among prostituted women, documented that many of these women had been models, artists or students before addiction forced them into sex work. They hadn't chosen prostitution, they'd been chosen by economics and chemistry. Prescription fraud became more sophisticated. According to court records, people weren't just forging signatures anymore. They were stealing entire prescription pads, creating counterfeit pharmacy stamps, even impersonating doctors. The Tribunal Correctionnel de la Seine prosecuted 234 cases of prescription fraud in 1924, up from 47 the previous year. And crucially, people turned to crime as part of their using networks. Couples who had been supporting two habits on artistic income suddenly couldn't. According to social worker reports preserved at the Centre d'Archives Contemporaines, a common pattern emerged. One partner would commit crimes, usually theft or fraud, while the other maintained the appearance of legitimacy, keeping the apartment, the prescription relationship with a sympathetic doctor, the connection to legal society. This division of labour appears repeatedly in police files. In one case, documented by historian Anne-Claude Ambroise Rondeau, a painter named Henri Gautier and his partner Marguerite Deschamps maintained their heroin supply through an explicit arrangement. Henri would forge cheques and Marguerite would cash them at different banks, changing her appearance slightly each time. They sustained this for 7 months before being caught. The regulation created something else too: violence within the distribution network. When heroin was available at pharmacies, there was no territorial competition, no enforcement necessary. But an illegal market required a different structure. According to police reports from the Brigade des Stupéfiants, turf wars began appearing in late 1924. Dealers competed for territory. Users who couldn't pay faced threats. The violence wasn't widespread yet, nothing like what would come decades later, but it was present and growing. The medical establishment watched this unfold with horror. Dr. Henri Claudel, who had defended heroin's therapeutic value in 1923, published a remarkable reversal in late 1924. In an article titled Our Failure with Heroin, preserved at the Académie nationale de médecine, he wrote, "We believed we were offering medicine. We were distributing poison. We believed we were treating addiction. We were creating it. The fault is ours, and the consequences will outlive us." But acknowledgement didn't mean effective response. The government's next attempt came in January 1925, an outright ban on heroin for any purpose except extreme pain in terminal illness. No more prescriptions for melancholy or artistic exhaustion or chronic pain or any of the other conditions that had justified earlier use. According to implementation records studied by historian Marion Fontaine, this ban created immediate chaos. Thousands of people who had been using heroin legally for years suddenly became criminals overnight. The black market exploded, and because pharmaceutical heroin was now almost completely unavailable, purity dropped dramatically. Street heroin in 1925, Paris, according to police laboratory analyses preserved at the Institut de Médecine Légale, averaged between 30–50% purity, cut with everything from powdered milk to strychnine. Users had no way to know what they were taking. Overdoses increased 340% in the first 6 months of 1925. The failed response had a particularly cruel effect on couples. When both partners were using, every dose became a calculation. Do you split it evenly, even if one person's tolerance is higher? Do you take turns going without? Do you prioritize whoever needs to maintain employment or social connections? Letters from this period, preserved in various archives, reveal couples making terrible choices. In one exchange between painter Jules Passin and his partner Hermine David, studied by art historian Kenneth Silver, they discuss which of them should use their remaining heroin. Passin had a meeting with a gallery owner, but David was in worse withdrawal. They decided he should use it, take the meeting, hopefully make enough money to get more. The meeting went poorly. They couldn't get more until 3 days later. Her letters from those 3 days describe suffering that reads like torture. The regulation also exposed class differences that had been hidden when heroin was legal. Wealthy users could still obtain pharmaceutical heroin through private doctors willing to risk their licenses for substantial fees. Poor users had no choice but the black market. According to social service reports from the Assistance Publique, wealthy heroin users rarely appeared in hospitals or courts. They had the resources to maintain their addiction privately. The users filling hospital beds and jail cells were increasingly from the working class, people whose addiction had cost them their livelihoods. By mid-1925, the Parisian heroin scene looked completely different from 1922. What had been a medicalized, culturally accepted practice had become a criminal activity dominated by an illegal market. The users hadn't changed. Many of the same people who'd been using pharmaceutical heroin were now using street heroin, but their circumstances had transformed entirely. And nobody in government seemed willing to acknowledge the obvious. Prohibition hadn't reduced demand. It had just made supply dangerous and turned users into criminals. The economic crash came in April 1925. After years of post-war inflation, the French franc collapsed. According to economic data from the Banque de France, analysed by historian Kenneth Mouret, the franc lost 35% of its value against the dollar in 3 months. Rents increased. Food costs surged. The expatriate artists who'd made Paris affordable on American or British income suddenly found their money worth substantially less. For heroin users, the crash was catastrophic. The drug was already expensive because of prohibition. Now everything else became expensive too. According to municipal records from the Archives de Paris, eviction rates in Montparnasse and Saint-Germain-des-Prés increased 60% between April and August 1925. Users faced impossible choices: pay rent or buy heroin, buy food or buy heroin. The physiological reality meant heroin won these calculations most of the time. Withdrawal was too severe. The drug had become more necessary than shelter. Hospital admission records from the Hôpital Boucicaut, studied by medical historian Bertrand Weil, show a sharp increase in malnutrition cases among known heroin users starting in mid-1925. Doctors noted patients presenting with obvious signs of severe addiction alongside symptoms of starvation. They were spending their food money on heroin. The compound effect hit relationships hardest. Couples who'd been barely sustaining 2 habits on their combined income suddenly couldn't sustain either habit. Arguments over money became constant. According to police reports, domestic violence calls from apartments known to house heroin users increased dramatically in summer 1925, and people disappeared. This is harder to document. There are no good statistics on people who simply left Paris in 1925. But the absence shows up in negative space. Artists who had been fixtures of cafe society stopped appearing. Names that appeared regularly in exhibition catalogues and literary journals vanished. According to memoirs from survivors like Man Ray and Kiki de Montparnasse, people just stopped showing up one day and nobody knew where they'd gone. Some returned to their home countries. Some died, from overdose, from infections, from suicide. Some ended up in institutions. According to psychiatric hospital records from Sainte-Anne and Villejuif, admissions for morphinism and heroinism increased 280% in 1925. The most documented disappearance is Raymond Radiguet, though technically he died of typhoid fever in December 1923, before the worst of the crisis, but his death was heavily influenced by heroin use. According to his medical records, studied by biographer James P. McNabb, Radiguet's heroin use had severely compromised his immune system. A typhoid infection that might have been survivable killed him in 3 weeks. He was 20 years old. Jean Cocteau's response to Radiguet's death illuminates how thoroughly heroin had restructured grief and love. According to his biographer Claude Arnault, Cocteau dealt with the loss by increasing his heroin use dramatically. His logic, expressed in letters to friends, was that heroin was the closest he could get to Radiguet now. They had used together, the drug was their shared language, using it was a way of maintaining connection with someone who no longer existed. This grief through continued use appears in other accounts too. When Jules Passin committed suicide in 1930, his death heavily influenced by years of heroin use and alcoholism, his partner Herman David reportedly continued using heroin for months, describing it as maintaining a connection to him. Addiction and mourning had become impossible to separate. The collision of prohibition, economic crisis, and accumulated addiction created a specific form of social death. The tight-knit community of artists and writers who'd used heroin together in cafes in 1922 had fragmented by 1925. Trust was gone, everyone was desperate, and desperation made people unreliable, manipulative, potentially dangerous. Former friends became competitors for scarce supply. According to Jean Cocteau's journals from 1925, preserved at the Centre Pompidou, he wrote, "We used to share everything. Now we hide from each other. Everyone suspects everyone of having more than they admit, of holding back, of lying. The drug that was supposed to reveal truth has made us all liars." The social infrastructure that had supported using communities collapsed. Cafes that had tolerated drug use began banning known users. Too much police attention, too many fights, too many customers who couldn't pay their tabs. Landlords evicted tenants with heroin problems. Galleries stopped working with artists known to be using. By late 1925, according to police reports and social service records, the Parisian heroin scene had stratified into three groups. First, wealthy users who maintained their habit through private doctors and could still afford the inflated prices. Second, functional users who were barely hanging on, maintaining precarious employment or relationships that provided just enough money. Third, the completely marginalised, homeless users, institutionalised users, users who turned to crime and were cycling through jails. The artist community that had embraced heroin in 1922 was gone. What remained was scattered individuals managing addiction in isolation, or small clusters of mutual dependence that functioned more like survival networks than communities. And the response from French authorities remained fundamentally unchanged: criminalisation, stigmatisation, and a medical establishment that had largely given up on treating heroin addiction because they didn't know how. Here's what we've witnessed: a complete transformation from optimism to catastrophe in less than 5 years. In 1920, heroin was medicine prescribed by respectable doctors, sold by reputable pharmacies, embraced by an entire artistic community as a tool for enhanced consciousness and deeper connection. By 1925, it was an illegal drug, distributed by criminal networks, used by desperate people whose lives had been largely destroyed by the same substance that once promised liberation. The numbers tell part of the story. According to historian Emmanuel Ritelot-Béjac's comprehensive analysis, published in Les Stupéfiants en France, an estimated 40,000 people in Paris were regular heroin users by 1925. Overdose deaths increased from 12 in 1920 to over 400 in 1925. Arrests for drug-related crimes increased 15-fold. Hospital admissions for heroin addiction overwhelmed capacity. But statistics miss the intimate devastation. Relationships destroyed by a drug that promised to deepen them. Artists who never fulfilled their potential because their creative energy was consumed by maintaining supply. Love that transformed into mutual dependence that looked like love but felt like drowning. Jean Cocteau survived. He underwent several painful attempts at withdrawal over the years, repeatedly relapsed, but ultimately lived until 1963. His writings about heroin, especially Opium, The Diary of a Cure, became foundational texts for understanding addiction. But he also spent decades dealing with health problems caused by his years of use, and many who knew him said he never fully escaped the psychological grip of the drug. The others we've encountered didn't fare as well. Kiki de Montparnasse struggled with heroin addiction for years, her modelling career derailed, though she eventually achieved stability and wrote her influential memoirs. Maurice Sachs was arrested multiple times, collaborated with Nazis during the occupation, and was killed under murky circumstances in 1945. Jules Passin committed suicide in 1930. Many others simply vanished from the historical record. No more mentions in memoirs, no more exhibition catalogues, no records of what became of them. The French government's response to the heroin crisis shaped global drug policy for decades. In 1925, France signed the International Opium Convention, committing to restrict heroin manufacturing and distribution. This pattern, pharmaceutical development, widespread use, addiction crisis, prohibition, would repeat with other drugs throughout the 20th century. But here's what makes this story more than historical curiosity. We're still having the same arguments today. Is addiction a medical problem or a criminal one? Does prohibition reduce harm or increase it? Can we distinguish between appropriate pharmaceutical use and destructive addiction? These questions weren't resolved in 1920s Paris, and they remain unresolved now. The pattern repeats with predictable precision. In the 1990s, pharmaceutical companies assured doctors that OxyContin was non-addictive, that it represented a breakthrough in pain management, that previous concerns about opioid addiction were overstated. Doctors prescribed it liberally. Addiction followed. The opioid crisis that's killed hundreds of thousands of Americans follows the exact template established in 1920s Paris. Pharmaceutical optimism, widespread adoption, addiction crisis, prohibition that creates a dangerous black market. According to contemporary addiction neuroscience, we now understand why heroin is so catastrophically addictive. It doesn't just create pleasure, it hijacks the brain's fundamental reward circuitry, the same system that evolved to motivate eating, drinking, and reproduction. Chronic use physically restructures the brain, creating a state where heroin becomes as necessary as food. The people in 1920s Paris weren't weak or immoral. They were experiencing a neurological process that no amount of willpower could overcome. But understanding the mechanism doesn't solve the problem. We know more about addiction neuroscience now than doctors knew in 1925. We have medications that can ease withdrawal and reduce cravings. We have therapy approaches that actually work. Yet we're still arguing about whether addiction is a disease or a choice, still criminalizing drug users, still creating black markets through prohibition. The couples who used heroin together in Montparnasse cafes believed they were deepening their connection. They weren't wrong about the feeling. They were wrong about the mechanism. The intimacy they experienced was real, but it wasn't revealing truth. It was chemistry mimicking meaning, neural pathways being rewired in ways that felt like love but functioned like dependency. This distinction matters because it's universal. Humans constantly mistake feeling for truth, chemistry for meaning, intensity for depth. We do this with romantic love, with religious experience, with political conviction. The heroin users of 1920s Paris were just doing it with a drug that made the consequences visible faster and more dramatically. What they lost, what we all lose when we mistake chemistry for truth, is the possibility of actual intimacy. Real connection requires vulnerability without chemical mediation, presence without the buffer of altered consciousness, the ability to tolerate discomfort without escape. Heroin offered none of this. It offered counterfeit connection that felt more profound than the real thing, until it destroyed the capacity for real connection entirely. Here's what haunts me about this story. They were so close to having everything they wanted, Paris in the 1920s was genuinely liberating, a place where artists could live cheaply, experiment freely, love openly, create without constraint. They didn't need heroin to have that. The city was already offering liberation. But the promise that heroin could enhance that freedom, deepen that experience, make consciousness itself more vivid, that promise was impossible to resist. And once they'd crossed that threshold, once their brains had adapted to heroin's presence, liberation became imprisonment. The drug that was supposed to free them from social constraint instead trapped them in physiological dependence. The experience that was supposed to reveal truth instead made truth impossible to distinguish from withdrawal. So here's the question that lingers. What are we doing right now that will look a century from now as obviously destructive as heroin in 1920s Paris looked to us? What are we embracing as liberation that's actually creating new forms of dependence? What's the contemporary equivalent of respectable pharmacists handing out heroin with medical blessing? I don't have the answer. Neither did they. That's what makes history both terrifying and essential. The knowledge that people making decisions that seem reasonable at the time are often creating disasters they can't yet perceive. The doctors who prescribed heroin weren't evil. They were wrong. The users who thought they could control their consumption weren't stupid. They were human, facing a neurological process that humans aren't equipped to control through willpower alone. The legacy isn't simple. The artists of 1920s Paris created enduring work, despite their heroin use, not because of it. Jean Cocteau's films and writing remain influential. The cultural ferment of Montparnasse shaped modernism. But we'll never know what was lost. The books never written, the paintings never finished, the relationships destroyed before they could become something real. It's 4 a.m. now for some of you. You've stayed with this story for 30 minutes, following people through addiction and loss a century ago. Thank you for that attention. Thank you for being willing to sit with complexity, to resist simple moralism, to engage with the actual human experience behind historical events. If this story meant something to you, leave a comment. Not just great video. Tell me what it made you think about, what parallels you saw, what questions it raised. This kind of content exists because people like you care enough to engage with it. The people in this story are dead now. Their struggles are over. But the patterns they lived through, the collision of chemistry and consciousness, the confusion of intensity for meaning, the transformation of medicine into poison, these patterns are still active. They're still destroying lives. They're still demanding we figure out better responses than we've managed so far. We haven't solved this. We've just moved on to different drugs, different mistakes, different disasters we can't yet perceive. And somewhere, a century from now, someone might tell this story, our story, with the same mix of compassion and horror we feel looking back at 1920s Paris. The question is whether we're willing to learn before we become someone else's cautionary tale.